This is Center Stage, putting your firm in the spotlight by highlighting business owners and other industry experts to help take your firm to the next level. Hey everyone, and welcome to Center Stage. I'm your host, John Henson, and I am really excited about this week's topic. I've mentioned before in a couple of previous episodes that I was diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder last year. And as I kind of started that journey to just learn more about it, to really get more of a framework to help me understand how my mind works and maybe how I fit into this world, and looking for some new resources and stuff, I really saw a huge need when it came to most people, not even just business owners, but just people in general, lacking an understanding of what it means, what the autism spectrum is, what it means, and how people even just view neurodiversity in general with other conditions. And so this week I am joined by attorney Haley Moss, who, on top of being an author and a speaker and a consultant, also has autism. And she is here to help us understand what exactly that means, and also just talk about, the skills that people in this community possess, and how maybe even you as a firm owner can work with people in the neurodiverse community. And I'm really excited. Haley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. And even before we got started, and thank you for sharing a little bit about your journey too. It's always really impactful for me to get to share the stage with other autistic people. It's something that I feel like we rarely get to do outside of our own community. So just being here today feels very special. And thank you for sharing, not just with the listeners, but also with me.
Absolutely. So before we jump in, tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey, and how you even, got to become, decided to become a lawyer.
I feel like we have a lot to unpack there because there's a lot of journey stuff, but I am someone who honestly doesn't always feel the most comfortable talking about myself because I'm always afraid that it sounds really self-centered. I think that's something that happens as autistic people. So if you don't know, one of the biggest things that is a hallmark of autism is that we have differences in social communication and understanding. Is
Yeah.
the way that our brains work is inherently just different than non-autistic people. So I'm always afraid that when I'm asked to talk about myself, I'm always thinking, does this come off really self-centered? Does it seem very selfish, even though I'm doing what I'm being asked to do? And also a
Right.
lot of times when it's share your journey and things like that, like those really open-ended questions can be very much interpreted. So that's something I think business owners and firm
Yes.
owners, especially if you've ever been through a job interview and you've had someone tell me about yourself, if you ask me to tell me about myself, I might tell you the whole life story that I'm assuming is what you want me to share, like kind of like the Cliff Notes version of, or I might say, here's a bunch of stuff that's not on my resume that I think is interesting, like that I really like Taylor Swift. I watch a lot of sports. I love spending time with my friends. I am very much excited that in the past 2 months we had new Pokemon games came out, and I don't think that's what people want to hear.
Yeah.
So that's why I always try to keep it very realistic, and that's something that you will learn about me and maybe other folks on the spectrum, is that sometimes having a good communication or clear communication goes a long way. So kind of to
Yeah.
back up a little on this journey, is I was diagnosed with autism back in the late 90s. So very different time. I feel very fortunate to have been identified as a toddler, and that was mostly because I was not someone who spoke. When you are a non-speaking kid or a late speaking kid, people immediately think something is wrong with you. They also think something tends to be wrong with you, quote unquote, when you're not hitting the same milestones. You're not making friends. You're sitting alone in preschool, spinning the wheels on toy buses instead of engaging with the other kids. I was famously asked to leave my preschool because I wasn't doing the same things other children
Wow.
were. I wasn't coloring inside the lines. I wasn't drinking out of a cup the proper way. I was just not very socially engaged, like all of these things. But at the same time, I was able to read. I was doing giant jigsaw puzzles. Like it was clear the lights were on. It's just that things weren't clicking. So
Yeah.
my parents thankfully connected with the folks at the University of Miami who helped get me diagnosed and help get me services and things like that. So that was kind of the beginning of my journey. I didn't start really talking until maybe a year or two later, but most of my early speech was just repeating things that other people said. If
Mhm.
you are very into the science and kind of precision of this, it's something known as echolalia. But I always tell people, if you do not know what that means, think of human parrots, or think of every time that you kind of watch your favorite show and you repeat all your favorite lines from movies and things and nobody thinks anything of it. except imagine that is pretty much all the talking that you do, and then people just think that something is definitely off.
Yeah.
So it took probably until the first grade till I had novel speech and things that weren't just repeating back things other people said. And I was always pretty quiet, which most people who know me are always very surprised that I say that I'm a pretty quiet person in my real life, because I feel like when you are an attorney, when you're doing things like this, or you're
Hmm.
educating folks, it seems like you're very extroverted and really thrive off of being around people, but I'm pretty quiet. I'm pretty shy. I don't have a lot of friends. I didn't make a lot of friends growing up. All my friends growing up were actually boys because I played a lot of video games, which probably explains why I'm still very excited about new Pokemon coming out. So there's like little things about my life story and who I am today that really you're like, yeah, that definitely checks out. But I didn't think I wanted to become a lawyer, if you want me to be completely honest with you. And
Yeah.
I think that we peg very early on the children or young people that we assume are going to be great attorneys. That we think of the kids who are on Model UN. We think of the poli-sci majors in college. We think of the ones who are arguing and bossy and demanding. And we have this kind of idea in our heads, debate, think of all these activities of who we think is going to be a great lawyer. I
Yeah.
did absolutely none of those things. I spent my early extracurriculars in drama. I spent my
Hmm.
time in the fine arts. I love to draw and paint. I was on the school newspaper when I was in high school. I was the editor of the editorial and opinion section because I loved knowing what everybody else was up to. Also, it
Hmm.
had comics. So that was my favorite thing to do when I was in high school. Definitely. And I majored in psychology. I thought I was going to be a doctor. I wanted to be a psychiatrist because, as someone who naturally does not understand people, I thought
Hmm.
the best thing possible to do was understand the science of the human brain and
Yeah.
then help other people with their problems. It sounded like a great plan until about 6 weeks into undergrad, when I started having to get to like the first exam in chemistry. And I
Mm.
realized I am not indeed a science autistic. So if you know anything about the autism stereotypes, it's usually assumed that we are some form of STEM geniuses, a la Sheldon Cooper on The Big Bang Theory, or Bill Gates,
Right.
or what types of personalities. I did not live up to that,
Yeah.
as many folks who go to law school often joke that's why we went to law school.
Nice.
But
Yeah.
that's not why I went to law school, I promise. And
Yeah.
even though sometimes I'll say that's why I went to law school, but really I went to law school because when I realized I was not going to go into the sciences, I had to think about what is it I actually enjoy doing. And I realized
Right.
I actually like to talk to people. I like to write, and I want to be able to give back. And then I sat down and realized, oh, that's kind of what lawyers do.
Hmm.
That they help their communities, they're change makers, they talk a lot, and they actually write a lot. I did not realize how much writing lawyers did because I didn't really know any lawyers. That
Yeah.
I had a relative who I didn't reconnect with until my 2L year, who was a lawyer, but I didn't know anything about what he did. So, to be quite honest, it was kind of this later on of, oh, this makes sense for the things that I'm good at, and I can actually do something. This sounds like a good idea. So that's how I
Yeah.
ended up going to law school and wanting to become a lawyer, because it's something I just didn't think was for me. I really did think lawyers fit that specific mold of
Right.
people that were going to be the Model UN, the debate team, the poli-sci majors. And then, of course, you get to law school and you realize the poli-sci majors are the only ones who could at least tell you the difference between state and local government for about 2 days.
Right. Yeah. No, it's
Federal.
really interesting hearing you tell that story, because hear a lot of things that I have in common with you. You know, you talked about you don't talk a lot. You didn't have a lot of friends growing up. You're naturally very quiet,
Mhm.
but then you also enjoy like public speaking.
Mhm.
And like I feel
It's
like I'm the same
so much
way.
easier for me to talk to a group of people than
Right.
it is for me to go out to dinner with like five.
Yeah.
I always I always explain this to folks. Like, it's so much easier for me to talk to a room of 5,000 or to hang out with you one-on-one. You put me at the traditional lunch table at a luncheon, or think of when you're in high school and you sit with the group.
Yeah.
Nope, not my
Yeah.
thing. I will be
Yeah.
completely silent almost the entire time unless you address me directly, because I don't know, when am I supposed to interject? What if I monopolize the conversation? What do I say?
Yeah.
What if I don't know anything about this topic? I don't want to have 7 people looking at me funny. That you're
Yeah.
just so self-conscious, and also the energy it takes to kind of appear socially competent in those situations
Right.
is demanding and exhausting, and makes you feel kind of insecure, kind of just awkward and
Mhm.
scared. Like, it's just
Yeah.
not fun. And that's this whole idea of kind of autistic and neurodivergent masking, which we could be here all day
Oh,
discussing
yeah.
about this idea of trying to appear socially competent, often to our own detriment.
Yeah.
Other people feel more comfortable, so they don't think of us as strange or weird, or that they don't have to accommodate us. And there's so much social pressure to do it. And at the end of the day, it just leaves you feeling completely empty.
Yeah.
It's like the permanent customer service persona.
Yeah, exactly.
Even when people are absolutely terrible, you have to smile and nod and everything is fine, even though the world is on fire.
Right. Yeah,
You
absolutely.
can't
Yeah.
just say the world is on fire or like, I agree with you.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Right.
You have to be like, well, yeah, I hear
Yeah.
you, but I can't do anything. You're like,
Yeah. We're in it. We're just gonna have to get through it. Yeah. Yeah.
like, no,
Yeah.
that
And
life
then
is
the
not
other
meant to be lived
thing,
like that.
yeah. And then the other thing you mentioned, you talked about how much you love writing. That's
Mhm.
another thing is like I've written like 24 books on just like history and stuff. And like that's just the thing that I do. I can sit there and I can write about anything for days and days and days. But yeah, it's just I can't do math. Like I'm not a numbers guy at all. And so it's just really interesting to see those parallels there. I did want to
And
ask
then you
you.
probably fall down that rabbit hole when you find something really interesting or that you're writing about. Cause I'm like, if you've written 24 books, I could tell you've probably fallen
Yeah.
down the rabbit hole.
Oh
And
yeah.
then nobody hears from you for like weeks on end, or you forget to like eat. So something else my body does with the autism is I have issues with interoception. So my body doesn't always signal to me like, hey, you need to eat. You
Interesting.
haven't had food. I don't have those same cues sometimes. So I can get suckered into the rabbit hole of something I'm really passionate or interested on. And then all of
Yeah.
a sudden everything else goes out the window. Like I don't realize I'm thirsty. I don't realize I'm hungry. I don't realize like I have to do things because time just goes.
Yeah.
And that my body doesn't always send the cues. And I didn't even realize that was an autism thing until my early 20s. Like,
Oh yeah.
oh, that explains why I never recognize if I'm full, or that I will forget to eat 3 meals a day, that it's
Yeah.
not some moral or inherent failure of adulthood so much as my body literally doesn't send the signals.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
have to plan around that. Like if you want me to eat 3 meals a day, I literally have on my calendar basically like, okay, assume if this is a typical schedule, you're eating something at 7 to 8 a.m., 12 to 1 p.m., and anywhere between 5 and 7 p.m. Like that's the only way it's going to happen is
Yeah.
make sure something gets consumed in those 3 time periods, regardless of what body cue is happening.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. It's
ridiculous.
really, really, really interesting.
I have to think
So
like that. And that's kind of how I describe it. Is like a lot of times you're lacking common sense when other people just know how to do these things almost intrinsically. And you're like,
mm,
how?
yeah, but it's really just brain is just wired differently than
Exactly.
what it's the term is neurotypical, like what neurotypical people have going on. But I did want to ask you, we talk about neurotypical versus neurodiversity. Obviously autism spectrum's in that neurodiversity realm. What other medical conditions would fall into that neurodiverse community on top of
Oh,
autism?
oh my gosh. So I always like to say that this is pretty much anybody whose brain works outside of what is societally expected. So the
Mm,
more that I think about it and the more that I kind of get philosophical, the more I wonder what neurotypical really means.
mhm.
That I wonder like how many of us are neurotypical, but we have such high standards as a society that we all fall short.
Mm,
That think of how much social pressure we have to act a certain way and things like that. So that's kind of
yeah,
my own little discovery point right now in how many people don't know if they're neurodivergent in any way, shape, or form. And they've been
yeah,
thinking that they're neurotypical, just don't know. So
yeah,
I also try to be a little bit hesitant to say this is just for people who are diagnosed or have known medical or known
right,
disabilities, because there's so many reasons folks don't get access to diagnoses, or they realize that they're self-identifying with a lot of the traits or eventually come to a self-diagnosis, which I get asked a lot about. And usually I say, hey, look, if that is something that will help you on the path to discovery and understanding yourself, great. There's so many reasons folks don't get access to that. Like as adults, it depends on your healthcare situation. It depends on where you live, money, things that you
mhm,
don't want to have to think about or have to put into that equation. So
yeah,
gender, even like there's like we can be here all day kind of unpacking some of this,
oh yeah,
but I always look at it as if your brain works outside of this prescribed idea of neurotypical and normal, you may be neurodivergent. But people who do fall on this umbrella is not just your typical autism slash ADHD slash learning disabilities, which people think are kind of the hallmarks of neurodivergence and neurodiversity.
Mhm.
Neurodiversity as a whole is every single one of us because we all have different brains. So when we think about
Yeah.
who's neurodivergent, yes, we do have our friends on the spectrum. We do have our ADHDers. We also do have our friends with learning disabilities like dyslexia and the like. That's
Mhm.
who the workforce typically thinks of. But when we think of this broader definition of folks whose brains are outside of this neurotypical box, we're also thinking of people with intellectual disabilities. We're thinking of people who may have neurological disabilities that do have physical manifestations as well. So I know folks would say cerebral palsy, which we typically think of as a physical disability, who will
Mhm.
also identify as neurodivergent because it affects their neurological function.
Mm.
I also do usually put mental health conditions in this bucket. I know some people don't, but I do
Mm.
because it does impact how your brain functions, how you experience
Yeah.
the world. And even if you are someone in that traditional autism, ADHD, learning disability bucket, you probably have had something to do with your mental health, or often there's a lot of overlap. So you have to be able to talk about everything together.
Yeah.
But usually when I do talk about neurodiversity, on top of our big stars that everybody knows, I really do try to bring intellectual disabilities and mental health slash psychiatric disabilities to the forefront. Since they get
Yeah.
the short end of the stick, they usually get the most stigma and people just don't get it. On top of the fact that you can have any combination of different things that a lot of neurodivergent folks, you don't just have one thing, that you might have multiple things going on, or even that you might realize, oh, this is significantly impacting my life. The bigger question mark for a lot of folks is if they consider their neurodivergence a form of disability. And some people feel very, very strongly about, is this disabling in my everyday life? Is it
Mm.
societally disabling? Or does the stigma of disability make it that I feel even more uncomfortable with this? Like, that's a whole other story for folks. But I always look at it as you have two big umbrellas. Is your
Yeah.
bigger umbrella is disability, and your one of your little umbrellas underneath that is neurodivergence.
Yeah.
So for me, autism is a disability. It is disabling in my everyday life. It makes things harder than it has to be.
Yeah.
But I also realize a lot of that not is not just the autism, but also society's understanding and things that don't need to be harder than they are.
Yeah. And you made a really good point, early on when you're talking about, how everyone has, different abilities. And, I've talked before on other episodes, just, it's just kind of where we are right now in our understanding of mental health, where this
Mhm.
is just how it's been categorized. You have neurotypical versus neurodiverse slash disability. And, I've talked before, just like as the science continues to advance, my hope is that 30, 40 years from now, it's not necessarily seen as these two separate things. It's more just like everybody has a thing, or everyone is just unique in this certain way. And rather than trying to throw a blanket over, broad swaths of people, we are able to interact on a more individual basis and kind of navigate through life in that way.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not even what the label is, it's just how come certain things we've made everything harder than it has to be. So I look at everything
Yeah.
from this accessibility standpoint
Yeah.
of, if we did make things more accessible with neurodivergent people in mind, it benefits every single one of us, not just the neurodivergent people in the room. So
Yeah.
think about a lot of traditional disability accommodations that ended up benefiting everybody, even if you're not the intended audience. It's this idea of universal design, the curb cut effect, all that good stuff. So
Yeah.
if you've ever used closed captions on Netflix or on Instagram or even on Zoom, and you're not deaf, you have benefited from a disability accommodation that wasn't meant for you. And that's
Yeah.
not a bad thing. Whether you're a second language learner, whether you are a visual learner, whether it's just hard for you to focus on people talking, like all of these things help so many different people. So
Yeah.
that's how I always try to view this, is if we looked at everything from that access standpoint, everybody comes out on top.
Yeah. Absolutely. So when we're talking about in a professional setting, what have you seen, just in your conversations with people and, going to speak in front of these groups, how has being neurodiverse affected people positively or negatively in their careers in terms of just how, one thing, for example, that I hear a lot is just people may feel a lack of confidence in maybe their ability to meet expectations, or maybe they feel like they've got to tiptoe around something, based on, whatever condition they may have. What have you seen in your experience?
Oh my gosh. Usually the biggest thing that I see is a lot of the mental gymnastics around disclosing. Is
Hmm.
that a lot of folks are afraid to share that they are neurodivergent when they're in a workplace setting. And that's totally valid. Is that
Yeah.
there's people who are interviewing for jobs and like, I'm going to be treated differently. This is terrifying.
Hmm.
I don't want my supervisor to know, but I also need an accommodation. And it's a really messy thing for us to go through, or that you're going to be held to a different standard or expectation. I know I was held to different expectations and I was open because it was assumed I was a computer genius.
Mm.
And I was not. And I felt
Yeah.
like I had to live up to this kind of STEM genius stereotype to
Yeah.
prove that I deserve to take up the same amount of space, to have the same opportunities. And it ended up making me just feel insecure, self-conscious, and a little bit unhappy, to put it bluntly.
Yeah.
And it didn't let me do the things I was actually good at. And it made me really frustrated. And when you're a young person, especially in the workforce, and it's your first job or your first professional out of school job, especially, it's really nerve-wracking because you're afraid to say something.
Hmm.
And especially because so many autistic people in particular, we have the highest unemployment or underemployment rate of all disability groups, I'm pretty sure, or
Mm.
one of the highest. It's actually even worse when you go by college grads and higher,
Mm.
that you're thinking, I'm lucky just to be here. I don't want to do anything wrong. I don't want to say anything, even if this isn't the perfect fit. If I'm unhappy, if something seems off to me, I can't say anything, or I don't want to, because I'm lucky to even be here. And it's not fair to so many of us. And the other thing that happens is a lot of neurodivergent people are looked at as kind of having superpowers.
Yeah.
And whether you personally identify as having superpowers or not, that's 100% on you. But when other people expect me to have superpowers, it's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
And I say that very bluntly. And I feel like it's a lot of pressure because you feel like you have to perform. And what if you don't have that? What if
Yeah.
that isn't a superpower to you? And in fact, it's just you're trying to get through the day to day and trying to do the best that you can based on your ability in that given moment.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I didn't realize it beforehand, but like the first few years that I worked here at Spotlight Branding, I developed this kind of reputation, and people called me the wizard because I would, I could run through tasks really fast and just get a ton of work done, and that was just kind of the persona. It's like, oh, you're a wizard, you're a machine, you're a robot, and then, you know, it almost built this pressure. And I mean, I know they didn't intend for it, mean it in a negative way, but now, 4 or 5 years down the road, anytime I maybe didn't do something as fast, or someone had to follow up with me on something, there was like almost this internal panic, like, oh no, I'm not meeting these expectations. People are expecting me to be this wizard, this superhero, and I'm not doing it. And so now something must be wrong. And so there's just all of that internal stuff that a lot of people, may be dealing with, that they're not communicating. And so there's all that kind of pressure. It's a really, really good point. um, on the other side of that, I wanted to ask, how can a leader, a business owner, and I don't even know the right way to put this, like, take advantage of is definitely the wrong connotation, but like, how can they utilize and tap into the neurodiverse strengths
Mhm.
of an employee, but do it in a way where they feel comfortable and psychologically safe, was a term that
Yes.
I heard in a previous episode. What do you see?
Oh my gosh. So probably the biggest one is to actually consider the individual,
Yeah.
which sometimes seems very common sense, but it's amazing how often it gets overlooked, especially in neurodivergent hiring. And we want to take advantage or kind of
Hmm.
tap into all strengths. Think about even when I was talking about, being the tech genius or you being the wizard, is that
Hmm.
we're still human beings.
Yeah.
And for me, being tapped as the tech genius, there was nothing that I've said or done that illustrated that I was a tech genius, other than at the time I was 23 years old
Yeah.
and I had an autism diagnosis,
Yeah.
which somehow seem to equate to technology guru, for
Right.
lack of a better description.
Yeah.
And that was not what I was good at. If you asked me to list my strengths on a resume, like, you know, how they have the skill sections, I would never have put good at computers as one of those things. I
Right.
would put things like writing or analytical thinking or critical thinking or
Hmm.
art projects. I would put literally something else, research, like things I actually was enjoying and
Yeah.
wanted to do more of, or even public speaking, because
Hmm.
based on the assumptions of different social skills, it was not assumed that I would want to be client facing or that I'd want
Yeah.
to go to court when I very much did.
Yeah.
So when we look at people as individuals and we actually realize, wait, this person enjoys being around people or people relate to them, that's a good thing. We should consider putting this person in front of people.
Yeah.
And I didn't like the idea of being kind of the basement gremlin doing document review and tech tests. Is
Hmm.
it while and anytime I'd bring it up when I was new to other folks in the legal industry, they'd go, well, you're a first year associate. That's pretty typical. And
Hmm.
it wasn't, because I wasn't the only first year in my office. And the other first year that I was close with was sitting second chair, getting to argue motions and do other stuff. And I'm sitting there basically being the basement gremlin. And I was like, okay, yeah,
Yeah.
sounds about right. Okay. I see what's going on here.
Right.
And so I always say the first thing to do is consider the individual and their strengths. That's how you could really kind of harness the power of neurodiversity. And
Yeah.
it's something we don't want to be shy about. So something I always tell larger businesses is with that psychological safety is it means that you have to be willing to be accountable.
Yeah.
That you want someone to let you know if you mess up and also not be offended, take it personally and actually do your best to do better. And the
Right.
same goes for employees that we want to create that safety that we go, hey, this seems like this might not be working or there's something going on. You're more like, I always tell managers, because usually when we talk about neurodiversity and they realize some of these traits sound like someone they know, they
Hmm.
think it's their job to kind of suss out who is neurodivergent.
Hmm.
And that way we can support you. Is that,
Hmm.
oh, I suspect so and so has ADHD. I should try to support them based on that assumption or try to get
Hmm.
them to say it so I can unlock the accommodation potential in a larger firm or whatever. And I'm like, no. Your job is not, you are not a psychologist. It is not your job to armchair diagnose. It is your job to either make those assumptions. If you're going to make those assumptions for literally everybody.
Yeah.
Because then everybody can benefit from whatever support you're giving this person with ADHD. Because
Yeah.
we can all benefit from having more structure, better communication, having more firm deadlines on the calendar, whatever it might be,
Yeah.
that all of us can benefit, or even just knowing transparently what the review process is or how we're doing.
Yeah.
So your job is not to do that, but you also want to create an environment that if, say, so-and-so does have ADHD, they feel comfortable enough to go to you, disclose, and ask you to help them advocate for themselves or for you to implement some kind of accommodation solution. So
Yeah.
that's usually my thing is you want to create that type of safety, whether that's creating an affinity group, whether it's having a specific policy. There's so many different things that we can do. And the thing that usually kind of upsets me or makes me feel uncomfortable is a lot of the times with diversity and especially with disability and neurodiversity, it often falls on young people and new people to kind of
Yeah.
break that wall.
Yeah.
Because think about how the younger generations, and I think a lot about Gen Z that's younger than me. I'm one of the younger millennials.
Hmm.
And I think about how millennials and Gen Z have had a very different relationship talking about mental health than, say, my baby boomer parents.
Yeah.
And I mean that with nothing but love.
Oh
But
yeah.
for boomers in particular, mental health is a little bit more taboo to talk about
Oh yeah.
than millennials and Gen Z who will be like, yeah, sorry, I just feel depressed. I'm not coming in today or something.
Yeah.
So there is that generational divide too. And that's also why young people in particular are also a little bit more open. But it shouldn't have to fall on just the young people to kind of break the glass ceiling there of going, hey, my mental health is X, Y, and Z, or I am autistic. It shouldn't have to fall on that. Or the new people trying to kind of see what's going on in an organization and try to be like, hey, I'm here. This is what's going on. Like, no, I always feel very strongly about that. And it's a lot of work. So I don't want the new people, the young people, or the multiply marginalized folks to feel like they have to do all the work. You want there to be something for you. And also having to advocate for yourself for every single accessibility need or thing that would make your job or work life easier or better, it's
Yeah.
exhausting. Is
Yeah.
think about this. So I don't know if you've had this experience, especially as someone who's later diagnosed, but there's a lot of emphasis in disability communities as a whole on self-advocacy and
Mhm.
self-determination and independence. There's a lot of focus on it.
Yeah.
And self-advocacy skills are great for everybody, period,
Right.
full stop. Everyone should be able to advocate for themselves in a way that feels comfortable and safe for you. But we get it shoved down our throats. And at the same time, it ends up sometimes equating to if you don't advocate for every little thing, nothing will get done or no needs
Mhm.
of yours get met. Because if you don't ask, you don't receive.
Right.
But think about how exhausting it must be to advocate for every single thing, especially because people just don't know better, that it will drain you in the process. So I always think of self-advocacy as more of a collective activity than an individual one at this point.
Yeah.
And that's something I always say. Look, I know that we want to teach self-advocacy skills, especially to youth with disabilities. It's fantastic. But I really think that every single one of us has a role to play here, especially employers or people that have no connection, not
Yeah.
realizing that, oh, we can help advocate to realize there's a more transparent process to go through, that you don't have to physically walk into my office to be able to say this isn't working out, or we have an anonymous suggestion box, or we have something, or we have certain kind of guide rails in place to make sure that everyone is set up to succeed. And it's not just some do better than others based on some perceived notion on who's productive, who is motivated, who is able to sit at a desk from 9 to 5.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It to me, it's reversing it, right? Like, I think a lot of times business owners feel like, to your point, they pigeonhole neurodiverse people into a certain skill set, when really it's like you're going to get the best results if you just treat neurodiverse people the same way you would treat a neurotypical person coming in and applying for the job. You're not looking necessarily, at least first, at the person. You're looking at a certain skill set. You're looking for someone who is going to be able to do the job. If they need certain accommodations, fine, you should work to accommodate that, but you're looking for the skill set that you're looking
Ideally,
for.
yes, even
Yeah.
though I think a lot of us know that's not always how hiring works.
Right.
I have been in interviews where I've seen people get picked because they thought they were more fun to spend a potential airport layover with. Like I've seen that happen. Of who passed the layover test, even if they have semi-equal qualifications.
Right.
Like it's not always fair. It should be who is motivated, who has these specific traits we're looking for, but we often focus on things like soft skills, where a lot of folks who are very qualified, very diligent, very motivated, have a ton of potential, simply get overlooked.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah. It's, we have these sorts of discussions, whenever we're hiring people. It's like, yes, this person had a great personality. They'd probably be fun to hang out with. But this other person,
Mhm.
I feel like they would do a better job day to day in the things that we actually need them to do. And so, there's a really great point. Yeah, it's just, it's constantly reminding that you just have to look at the skill set, even though a lot of times that just doesn't end up happening. A lot, it's for hiring
Yeah,
managers, it's easy to be attracted to a more engaging personality, and be sort of persuaded to go in that direction, more with, just based on, whether it's recency bias, or so many different things going on there. But
exactly. Or even things like grades, which
yeah.
don't really tell you an awful lot, especially because I know for a lot of lawyers who per se are entering big law, if
Mhm.
you are brand new out of school, it's all about your grades, your law review, your moot court, and how you do in the off-campus interview process, which
Yeah.
is so unlike anything else you might ever go through when you're applying for a job.
Right.
That you have to somehow have all these quote unquote objective qualifications of grades, whatever, accolades, whatever. And then you have to get through this very unnatural interview process as well. So you have to be everything. I
Yeah.
always like to kind of go back to what is an ideal person in a role. And usually it's not a question we're very good at answering. And especially when you really look at how hiring works, and I spend a lot of time thinking about this with the
Mm,
advent of artificial intelligence, they're not going to be able to tell you who's ideal just who uses whatever buzzwords in their resume that
mhm.
meet your job description, to filter through the hundreds of different resumes and cover letters you might get. That you don't know who is passionate, you don't know who is motivated, you don't know who might be fun to hang out with and who might actually hit the ground running and potentially innovate and make this place better than we found it.
Yeah.
And that's how we miss out on so many good people. And I've had interviewers tell me, you didn't make enough eye contact. And I'm like, does that really matter?
Right. Yeah.
Like, think about the things that we look at as hallmarks of good people or ideal, and all these neurotypical social standards that hold so many people back.
Yeah.
That if I don't make great eye contact with you, you're going to assume I'm not trustworthy, or I'm a liar, or that I'm just very anxious and shy.
Mhm,
When really, I'm not making eye contact because I can't focus if
mhm.
I'm staring you straight in the eyeballs. That my entire attention span is looking like I'm looking at you and listening rather than actually listening. And
Yep.
then I will stare at you. You will be happy. Oh, look, she met this eye contact. I objective. And then you'll ask me to like recap what you said or what to do. And I'll just go, what?
Yep,
And
exactly.
then and it's like, take your pick. Like,
Right. Yeah.
everybody's different. If I am trying to pull a fast one on you, you will know because it is very obvious because I'm
Yeah.
not that good at it.
Yeah. So, what I know, you were very active in, educating and advocating for the larger neurodiversity community. What resources are available for both business owners and employees that they can either receive support or learn more about, neurodiversity and everything that's going on?
Okay. To receive support within your individual organizations, I know every single place is different, but I always tell people the first place you could check things out is don't be afraid to look at your healthcare benefits, because you might have access to something like an employee assistance program, you might get therapy covered, you might have
Mm,
all sorts of cool stuff that you didn't know can actually help you.
mm,
So that's a great first step if you were thinking, wait, I might be neurodivergent and I've never had an evaluation, never been checked out, never talked about this before. That is a great first step and you won't have to pay for it. So that's
yeah.
always pretty cool. That's always my first kind of plan of attack if you're already employed and that is something you really want to explore. If you want to explore on your own, there's all sorts of fantastic stuff out there. If you are thinking about what options are available to me for accommodations and all that, one of my favorite resources out there is the Job Accommodation Network. That is askjan.org. But if you want to learn more about neurodiversity, my biggest thing for you is learn from neurodivergent people, that we are the experts on ourselves. It feels very strange having my existence sometimes explained by a bunch of academics and parents in particular. And I mean that with nothing but love, because academics, researchers, parents, and siblings, and so many other people are really important in this conversation. But
Yeah.
they might not know, especially if they are neurotypical, mostly if they're neurotypical for that matter, what it
Yeah.
is like to exist as a neurodivergent person day to day, or
Yeah.
how to kind of survive and thrive in different situations. I have learned so much more about how to do things more organized, or how to pace myself, and the importance of taking breaks and things. I've learned that from other disabled and neurodivergent people, that
Yeah.
they've taught me more about myself in that matter than I could have ever expected. So I often do rest on the shoulders of giants. I'm very honest
Yeah.
about that. And
Yeah.
something else that other places you can learn from, other than just us, and a lot of us are very active on social media. We have communities. There's so much community in disability world as a whole. Neurodiversity is no exception. Autism is no exception. But some great organizations as well for lawyers and law students. The National Disabled Law Students Association, they also are going to have started a National Disabled Legal Professionals Association to go along with that. The Disability Rights Bar Association sometimes has some stuff. I know depending on the firm, you might have an employee or affinity group or resource group. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network is also someone that I enjoy their resources, as well as the Autistic Women and Non-Binary Network. There's so many amazing things out there, and some of the best ones truly are created in tandem or by and for neurodivergent people. And depending on the different condition, I probably have a huge list of different resources too. And also, I always like to tell people, don't just learn from me. I'm very happy to share my story, but I'm only one perspective. I only know what it is like to be me. I do not know what it is like to be a guy. I do not know what it is like to be queer. I do not know what it is like to be a person of color. I do not know what it is like to be from somewhere or have grown up somewhere other than the United States. Like
Yeah.
there's certain things I will never know. So it's important to get those perspectives too. That I
Yeah.
don't want to take up all the air in the room. And I do not claim to be, nor do I want to be, the spokeswoman for
Yeah.
neurodiversity. I am not, nor is that a job that I should be anointed in any way, shape, or form. I
Yeah.
hope that if this is your first conversation on this topic, that that's exactly what it is. It's not the last one. It's just the
Right.
first and a jumping off point to learn more.
Yeah, absolutely. And so speaking of learning more, I know you just said you don't want to be like the only resource for this, but how can people connect with you and learn more about the work that you do?
You can say hello to me on haleymoss.com. I also spend a lot of time on social media. So I'm on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and somehow I'm actually on TikTok, even though that's kind of new to me. But I am happy to connect with you however you find me and keep this conversation moving in the right direction.
Love it. Yeah, I mean, this has been really good. I mean, I've learned, like you said, like I've learned some things about myself, and it's just, just a really neat experience. Just hearing your perspective, and seeing, parallels that even I have with you, and hearing just some of the other experiences that you've had along the way, in your personal life and your professional life. And so I really do believe that the audience got a lot out of this as well.
I
I have
hope
one
so.
final question for you. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, I hope so.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I do have one final question for you before I let you go. And that is, if you had one final piece of advice for our audience, what would it be?
You're not alone. And I say that because I think a lot of the time, especially if you are someone who is struggling with your mental health or you are neurodivergent or you do have a disability, it's very easy to think it's just you
Mhm.
and you're the only one dealing with this. It's something I felt a lot as a young person. And there's so many times I find myself even now going, is this a me thing? Is this an
Mm.
autism thing? Is
Yeah.
this I am a young adult trying to figure it out? Or is this I really just am clueless? I never really know sometimes. And having support, whether it's your community, your family, your colleagues, whoever it might be, your friends, that is huge. And just realizing there's tons of people out there and there is a community of folks who get it
Yeah.
or who have similar experiences. And I know that's a really powerful thing. Like for me, every time I do have conversations with other neurodivergent, disabled, and autistic people, it's always a great experience for me because I realize it's not just me. And I've learned something from this, even if I didn't think I would or didn't know
Yeah.
that I would. So I really just want you to know that you're not alone on whatever journey it is you're on. And also, you're not a failed version of normal. I think it's very easy to feel like you are a failure of some sort because your brain doesn't brain the same way that other people's brains just do
Yeah.
things. There's
Yeah.
stuff that people do that I just genuinely don't understand. So I
Right.
know with things like New Year's, a lot of people, for instance, start a new planner that they keep for the whole year. And I'm like, how do you do that? Because I would last 2 days, I would color code it, I'd get it super organized, spend 2 days on it, and then by next week it would never exist.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. It's that for me, that's a great reminder there, because it's not, you're not broken. You're just, your brain functions in a way
Mhm.
that maybe a lot of people don't understand, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't mean you're broken, and it doesn't mean that the life that you have is, a waste or not going
Yeah.
to reach its potential. So
Or even the quality of your life. Like
yes.
in many ways, I find myself telling people I am pretty unexceptional. And I say this very deliberately. I
Mhm.
am 28 years old. I have a lot of the same dreams and hopes that most young people have. I have friends and family that I love to hang out with and spend time with. I would like to move to a bigger apartment because I would like an extra bedroom to use as an office. Like that sounds pretty typical people,
Yeah.
I would like to find love. I want to have a career that satisfies me. I am a total dork, like we talked about at the beginning of the show, like all sorts of different things about me. You're like, yeah, that doesn't sound like, anybody, that sounds like everybody else I know. And I'm like, exactly.
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
there's not that much that really separates us except how our minds work and how we experience the world around us.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean we're completely foreign species or like an alien. And it's so often equated to like, oh, autistic people are like Martians. It's like, no, we're not. We're
Right.
just, it's more like being a second language learner than being a Martian.
Right.
That you realize that you might not speak the same social language or know all the same rules just intrinsically, but it doesn't mean that you're completely from somewhere else or you don't know what's going on. It just means
Right.
that there's rules and things you're not going to pick up the way that someone who that's their first language would just inherently know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I completely agree. And I think this has been a really great conversation, a really great episode. I know all of you out there, I'm sure all of you out there learned something and have probably even more questions and things that you want to explore. I definitely recommend connecting with Haley and reaching out to her and seeing all the things that she's got going on in the conversations that she's having out there. Continue to rate and review the show wherever you're consuming it. And I really would love to hear what you thought about this week's episode. So feel free to reach out to me as well. But that's going to do it. Haley, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insight.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. To learn more, go to spotlightbranding.com/centerstage.